Good day. As before, just to remind you before I start with this program, that if you're watching any of our videos on Rumble, that's to say the Duran videos or Alexander Mercouris videos or Alex Christoforou videos, you can, if you go to the top of the video, see a red maroon button which you can press. That will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can, if you choose, join our thriving community, and if you become an active member, you can publish your own exclusive content and also join and participate in my Wednesday live streams, which are exclusive to locals and which take place at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Well, this has been a very interesting 24 hours. There's been massive amount of news and it's difficult to know exactly where to begin. But of course, all of it once more has to relate to this global crisis that is centered on events in Ukraine. And since we are going to be talking about events in Ukraine, I think perhaps the right place is to start with what is going on in Ukraine. Again, let me reiterate my long-standing point that I have no military background, no military experience, no military expertise at all, and everything that I obtain is from open sources. So, of course, I can't fully corroborate the information that I'm obtaining, and moreover, I'm not always perhaps the best person to assess what is happening. Nonetheless, we can, I think, get a fairly clear picture of what is going on. Now, the first thing to say is that, as the Russians said they would do a couple of days ago after the meeting with the Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul, they have carried out a significant drawdown of their forces in and around Kiev. Less so, from what I can gather, around Chernigov, where they would also said that they would draw down their forces, but certainly around Kiev, they have been drawing down their forces. Now, of course, the Russians have provided two explanations for this. The first explanation, which is the one given by the negotiators, was that it was a de-escalation measure in order to assist the negotiations to continue and to take away some of the pressure on the Ukrainian negotiators, some of whom are based in Kiev. I don't take that explanation especially seriously. But the second explanation, which has been provided by the General Staff in Moscow, is that these forces that were sent to Kiev were never intended to storm the city. They were intended instead to tie down Ukrainian troops in and around Kiev and around other cities which had been similarly encircled or threatened by the Russian military, allowing the Russians to proceed with their primary task, which was to cut off the major Ukrainian force in Donbass, which is the prime target of their military operations. Now, I have said that this has been the case for some weeks, and I feel, given what the Russians are saying on the second point, vindicated by that. I ought to make it clear that when I say that I've been saying this for some weeks and that I feel vindicated, obviously, and of course, I am basing it on the analytical assessments of others, many of whom are far more informed about military matters than I am. But it's been obvious to me that since very early on, since almost the first days, that the Russian forces in and around Kiev had no intention of trying to storm the city. The very day after the Russian forces entered Ukraine, the Russians began negotiations with the Ukrainians. There was some confusion and muddle about where the venue would be and about whether the Ukrainian representatives would arrive, but eventually talks did get underway in Belarus. And it always seemed to me to be inherently implausible that the Russians would want to invade a capital and overthrow a government with which they were actively negotiating. And if you go back over my previous videos, you will see that that is exactly what I said. Moreover, if you actually track Russian public statements, you will find that Putin himself justified the decision to intervene in Ukraine as being in response to an urgent call for military help from the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which claimed that they were under attack by the Ukrainians, and based on OSCE field reports, good cause. And he then gave an explanation of what Russian policy was on the 5th of March to a group of people from the airline industry, in which he said that the general staff, the Russian general staff, had advised that defending the two republics of the Donbass would not be possible if military activity were confined to the Donbass, because that would allow the Ukrainians to reinforce their forces in Donbass at leisure, and it would simply result in a perpetuation of the conflict and a congealing of front lines. And that, of course, was what the Russian military said last week, what General Rudskoy of the General Staff said last week, and what part of what General Shoigu, the defense minister, also said when they collectively said that they would start to pull back some of their troops from the area around Kiev. And the fact that these statements are consistent with each other, that they are consistent both with Russian actions and with Russian statements going back to the start of the operation, seems to me to make it fairly clear, at least to me, that indeed it is the case that the Russians are pulling back some of their troops, though it seems not all of their troops, from the areas in and around Kiev, in order that they can now concentrate on the Donbass, where they appear to feel that the main Ukrainian forces, the major military army, which has been, as I again have been saying in program after program, the main target of their operations, that force has indeed been cut off from resupply from the rest of Ukraine. So that seems to me clearly the position. Now, I do understand that there's lots of people who want to argue otherwise, who want to argue that the Russians were fought to a standstill in and around Kiev, and that they were even pushed back in places. Well, people are free to say that and to discuss it in those terms, but it does seem to me that if they want to do that, then it is incumbent upon them to go back over all those earlier statements of those Russian officials, including what President Putin himself said on the 5th of March, and explain how what they are seeing in and around Kiev and what they are claiming about what is happening in and around Kiev is consistent with those earlier Russian statements, especially Putin's statement of the 5th of March. I've never seen that done. It's as if those previous statements made by the Russians, indeed made by President Putin himself, did not exist and had never been made, even though the record of them is there out in the open. And if people want to claim that there's been some great Ukrainian victory in and around Kiev, despite, as far as I can see, all the evidence pointing to the contrary, well, it seems to me that they need to explain, at least I think they need to explain, how that is consistent with what the Russians have been saying and what the Russians have been doing ever since the start of these operations, and in respect of what President Putin himself said at that meeting with the airline industry on the 5th of March. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. It's clear that there's not been, at least not so far, a total pullback of all Russian forces from Kiev, and what some people are representing as Ukrainian advances seem to me simply a case of the Russians pulling out of particular towns and settlements, including the Chernobyl nuclear plant and the accompanying town of Slavutic, which, by the way, was only occupied by the Russians last week. They can. It seems to me, as I said, it's just a case of the Russians pulling out and the Ukrainians moving in. Now, what I find particularly odd about this is that these, I think, non-existent Ukrainian victories in and around Kiev have been happening at a time when the Ukrainians did carry out what was, in all respects, an extraordinarily successful and very daring military operation, and one which they could legitimately take bragging rights for, which was this airstrike on this Russian oil facility in the Russian town of Belgorod. Now, this appears to have been a remarkably well-executed operation, if you believe Russian accounts. Apparently 2 Mi-24 helicopter gunships flew from Ukraine almost at treetop height, evading radar cover, and were able to launch the missile strike on this facility and managed to return intact to Ukraine. So it was an operation clearly carefully planned, extremely well organized, and carried out with great courage and skill. And maybe it doesn't make a huge dramatic difference to the outcome of the war, but it's the sort of thing which I would have thought a military would want to play up, because it shows the daring and skill of their pilots, and of course it's the kind of thing that raises morale. And bizarrely, very remarkably, and completely inexplicably to me, the Ukrainians have now turned round and saying that they have absolutely nothing to do with this operation, that the strike on the Belgorod facility was not carried out by them. They're not saying who it was who carried out the strike, but presumably it was either the Russians, or maybe there was some kind of an accident or something. But they are actually distancing themselves from it. They spent hours refusing to comment on what had happened, and then a few hours later, late in the evening on Friday, Danilov, the head of the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, came out and published a straightforward denial, saying that the Ukrainians had absolutely nothing to do with this operation. Now, I have to say, I find this very strange, even if it was some kind of act by the Russians, some kind of act of negligence. I would have still thought that the Ukrainians, for morale reasons, if nothing else, would want to claim credit for it. And I'm really baffled as to what exactly was going on there. And it's been suggested, based on some comments that Dmitry Peskov, the President Putin's spokesman, said, that the Ukrainians were not happy, or at least the Ukrainian political leadership is not happy in some ways with this operation, because it somehow gets in the way of the progress of the negotiations with Russia. Now, again, I don't completely understand why that would be so. And for what it's worth, there was another virtual meeting yesterday between the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators. And the Russian chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, said that on the issues of Crimea and Donbass, the Russian position remains unchanged. So it seems that the two sides are still far apart, and it's not at all clear to me what exactly is going on there. Now, this may be connected with another rather strange event, which is that at about roughly the same time, I'm not exactly sure of the exact sequence, Ukraine's President Zelensky sacked to senior Ukrainian military commanders, accusing them of treason. Now, he didn't say who these two commanders, both generals, by the way, had committed treason with, but one of them, I noticed, is a very senior intelligence official. And again, I do wonder whether perhaps this had something to do with this helicopter raid. Now, I'm not sure, I'm just guessing here, but perhaps these negotiations with the Russians are progressing further and faster than we know. That might also explain a very strange article in the London Times a few days ago, which said that the British government is becoming increasingly concerned that Ukraine is making some significant concessions to the Russians over the status of Donbass and Crimea, and that Prime Minister Boris Johnson telephoned President Zelensky of Ukraine to try to dissuade him from making these concessions. Well, that all seems extremely strange to me. I'm not going to say that I have any real explanation for any of these events. I merely note them, and note them with some puzzlement. The one thing one can say with some confidence is that Medinsky, as I said, the Russian negotiator, has made it clear that on the status of Crimea and Donbass, the Russian position remains the same. So we'll just have to wait and see what this all means, and exactly why Ukraine is not giving itself credit for what seems to have been a spectacularly successful military operation. And I don't pretend I know. And even if it is the case that the Russians were annoyed about this and that this somehow unsettled the progress of the negotiations, again, I don't really see why. I don't see why the Russians would be dissuaded from negotiating from Ukraine by an airstrike like this, which, spectacular and as it was, and extremely embarrassing for the Russians as it also was, doesn't ultimately change the state of military operations. Anyway, no doubt, as I said, we'll be having more explanations of this very odd episode in the next few days. In the meantime, all the indications are of a major build-up of forces by both sides in the Donbass, with the Russians now moving huge forces. I've heard one claim that that the forces that are being built up around Donbass from the Russian side may number as many as 250,000 men. Can't confirm that. That does seem to me a very high figure. It may be exaggerated, but that this is a moment when the Russians seem to be preparing for the final destruction of the Ukrainian forces there. The Ukrainians themselves seem to be trying to re-establish some kind of new front line around Dnipropetrovsk, or Dnipro, as I believe it's now called in Ukraine, a city on the Dnieper River. Again, I can't talk about the military realities of this. Some put this force at about 40,000 men. It may be, as some are speculating, a force that's going to try and break through the Russian lines to reach those Ukrainian troops in Donbass to provide some kind of relief for them. Or alternatively, it could be an attempt to create a new front line. Either way, I'm not in a position to say. But all the indications are that there is a major Russian build-up going on in Donbass, and apparently there's been extremely heavy shelling of Ukrainian positions, and Russian forces are continuing to push south from the town of Izium, which they captured a few days ago. They seem to have built a pontoon bridge across a river in the area, and they're moving their forces ever closer to the central lines of these Ukrainian positions, and that will no doubt be the major battle that will be happening over the course of April, always assuming, of course, that there isn't some sort of diplomatic breakthrough in the meantime. I'd also say that there's been further information about the situation in Mariupol. It seems that the Ukrainian force there, which consists, as I understand it, mainly now of the remnants of the Azov regiment or battalion, now is said to number, the remaining forces, Ukrainian forces in Mariupol, are now said to number 4,000 men. Now, at the start of the siege of Mariupol, the Russians were saying that there were 14,500 Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. Then last week they were saying that it was 7,000. Now they're saying it's just 4,000. Now, I cannot, of course, verify or corroborate any of these figures. It could be that the Russians overestimated the number of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, or alternatively, and I have seen some pretty harrowing pictures from the city, it could be the case that the Ukrainians have suffered extremely severe losses, and of course, and hopefully, many Ukrainian soldiers have deserted and perhaps been taken prisoner. I certainly hope so. But whatever, it seems that there is this group of about 4,000 Ukrainian troops who are still holding out. They're isolated, it seems, in 3 pockets, of which the most important is the Azovstal steelworks, which has now come under cruise missile attack, presumably from the Russian Navy. I've seen the films. So we will see what happens. The Chechen chief, the Chechen president, Ramzan Kadyrov, is now in Mariupol. And yesterday, he gave the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal steelworks a day to lay down their arms, suggesting that if they didn't, then today, 2nd April, the Russians and the Chechens would go all in and would clear the steelworks. I'm not, again, able to comment on this, but it does seem as if the fighting in Mariupol is now approaching some sort of conclusion after a complicated operation. Now, there's a number of things that have been coming out about this. One of the things that I've read, and again, I want to stress again, I can't corroborate this, is that the operation in Mariupol took longer than had been intended, because following a Ukrainian missile strike on the city of Donetsk, some of the militia troops of the Donetsk People's Republic were withdrawn from Mariupol to attack the Ukrainian front lines in and around Donetsk city, to try and push them away so that they couldn't launch more missile strikes on that city. And that depleted the number of troops undertaking this clear-out operation in Mariupol. Now, I want to stress, I can't confirm that, but that's some suggestions that I've been seeing that might imply that that was the case. If so, then I'm going to say a rather sad thing in some ways, which is that missile strike on that residential area of Donetsk, utterly ruthless and callous as it may have been, might, from a strictly military perspective, have achieved the result that was intended to, which is that it slowed down the operation in Mariupol. And I suspect that if that is the case, there's probably been a great deal of argument and recrimination between the Russians and the leadership of the People's Militia over this diversion of troops from Mariupol to deal with the Ukrainian troops that undertook this missile strike. I mean, I can't be certain of this, but that seems logical. I would say that it is an inevitable result when a professional army allies with the militia, because of course the militia fighters who make up the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic are, of course, men who are, many of whom come from Donetsk and who have family there. So perhaps it's understandable that they would want to go and protect their families and their city, rather than perhaps focus on what is the primary target of the military operation, which is to clear Mariupol. In any event, if this is true, if this claim is true, and I want to stress again, these are reports, rumours even, I can't confirm them, but they do seem plausible. If it is true, then that missile strike did buy the Ukrainian defenders in Mariupol some more time, though ultimately I cannot see to what end, since they remain encircled, and it looks increasingly as if their end is now very much in sight. Somebody on the Ukrainian side clearly thinks so, because one of the great mysteries of these last days of the fight in Mariupol is that the Ukrainians have been sending helicopters into the Azovstal steelworks to try to evacuate some people from there. Now, there's again a great deal of uncertainty as to exactly what has been going on. There's been suggestions that up to 6 helicopters have been involved. No question at all that 3 of them have been shot down, 2 of them apparently with passengers on board. And the Russians claim that this is part of an attempt to evacuate the leaders of the Azov regiment, the commanders of the Azov regiment, from Mariupol before it falls. But it does still seem an extraordinary sacrifice, not just of helicopters, but of the very valuable and courageous pilots who fly them, to send them repeatedly into the Azovstal works, to apparently accept 50% casualties when these helicopters are shot down, and the brave men who man them are all killed. And again, I do wonder what the exact purpose of that is. Now, as I discussed in a live stream that Alex Christoforou and Gonzalo Lira and I did yesterday, there are rumours on the Russian internet that the people who were being evacuated from Azovstal are in fact Westerners. And I can't remotely confirm that, but perhaps the fact that the Ukrainians have gone to such extraordinary lengths to try to evacuate these people must be a sign that some of them are considered by Ukraine to be very important. And of course, if they are Westerners, that might provide some sort of explanation as to why this is being done. Who these people are, even if they are Westerners, that's another matter. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is the situation in Mariupol at the moment. One further piece of information that has come out, and this I do consider reliable. Some days ago, I speculated that the siege of Mariupol had pinned down around 30,000 Russian and Allied troops in order to bottle up this and then defeat this Ukrainian force that was occupying the city. Well, I've recently been given an entirely different figure, which is 50,000. 50,000 Russian and Allied troops concentrated in the fighting around Mariupol. Now, that must be a very significant proportion of the total Russian force in Ukraine. And putting aside the question of whether the Russian army in Donbass is indeed being reinforced on anything like the scale from Russia itself that we are hearing, even if, putting all that aside, once Mariupol falls, and after these 50,000 or so men have rested, and by the way, I should say I do believe this figure, well, that will release another 50,000 troops to participate in this climactic battle in Donbass, which is said to be coming. So that, I think, provides us with some clear overview of the battles, the fighting in Ukraine. As I said, I can't verify, corroborate any part of this, and I'm not, perhaps, as I said, the greatest military analyst, but that, it seems to me, provides us with a fairly reasonable picture of what is going on. I would say that even if this figure of 250,000 Russian troops that I've been hearing about is an exaggeration, it does seem to me that the forces that are now concentrating on Donbass are overwhelming, and presumably the Ukrainians know this, and this may be the reason why they may be pressing ahead with the negotiations with the Russians and are prepared to make concessions which have the British government so concerned. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is as fair a summary as I can make of the present military picture. Alongside the war, there are, of course, the various political and economic developments. And I'm just going to turn first to the political and economic developments. There was a very, very interesting article in the New York Times, which acknowledged finally what has now become self-evident to any detached observer, which is that after a few days of confusion and uncertainty, opinion in Russia, public opinion in Russia, has now crystallized and hardened in support of the war. And the New York Times made the point that those scattered anti-war protests that did take place in Russia in the days after the Russian intervention, in the first week after the Russian intervention, that those scattered protests have entirely ended. And there were some interviews with some of the people who'd been involved in these protests, some of the organizers, and they were admitting that support for the protests has collapsed. And very interestingly, they also basically said, and the New York Times appeared to admit, that one of the reasons why the protests have disintegrated is because the sanctions war that the Western powers have waged against Russia has appeared to be so over the top that it has convinced Russians, a critical mass of Russians, the great majority of Russians, that what their leadership is telling them, that the West is out to destroy Russia and to end Russia's position as an independent state, that is actually true. So the New York Times appears to be, in effect, admitting that in the place where it matters most, which is to say in Russia itself, the sanctions war, at least so far, has backfired spectacularly. In the same article, the New York Times also referred to a public opinion poll carried out in Russia by the Levada polling agency. The Levada polling agency is the one which is treated as being most reliable by Western media, because it's fundamentally, it's the people who operate it are fundamentally hostile to President Putin and his government. Well, Levada has admitted that President Putin's support now runs in Russia at 83%, double, if you like, more than double what President Biden's support in the United States does. Now, the New York Times, in fairness, does say that these are early days in the conflict. The full bite of the sanctions has not yet come. Perhaps in a few weeks or months, the mood in Russia may change. I think the opposite. I think that no doubt there will be some more difficult times in Russia, though it's now, I think, increasingly acknowledged that the total implosion of the Russian financial system and economy that some people in the West anticipated is not going to happen. But surely, certainly, there will be a recession, and certainly many people in Russia are going to suffer some hardship. But my own personal view is that it will not turn people against the Russian government. On the contrary, it will harden their antipathy, their antagonism towards the West, who they will blame for their problems. That, it seems to me, is the lesson of sanctions pretty much everywhere, and I see no reason to think that in Russia it will be any different. This has come along with a very interesting article in the Financial Times, and it reads that the title of which reads, German industry sounds alarm over energy rationing plan. And the subtitle says, supply crunch could devastate companies and cost economy tens of billions of rubles. And tens of billions of euros. I'm sorry, not rubles. And then it goes on to discuss in detail how large swathes of the German economy, particularly the chemical industry, the steel industry, all of these industries would be under enormous pressure if there was if the German government were indeed to move to rationing, and if Russia were indeed to cut off gas supply to Germany, and that the German economy would spiral into deep crisis. And it discusses especially a German Mittelstand company, Heinz Glas, which makes glassware for companies like Yves Saint Laurent, Tiffany, Estée Lauder. And it says that if there was an interruption of gas supply, it would probably close. And the article ends by saying that the Carletta Heinz, the proprietress of this company, says that moving production away from Germany would be the very last resort. That would be a very difficult thing to do, in my opinion, anyway. And then it says that she remained unimpressed by the political decisions that has led to her company facing an existential threat. Our country has really failed to secure a second source for gas. No company could do it this way. Well, there we go. So I have to say, we've had discussions in our previous programs about the gas for rubles deal. There have been some, I should say, rather interesting emails sent to me by some interesting people who've been providing more explanations of how this gas for rubles deal would work. I have to say that the amateurs, the people who run the German government, are no doubt having the full details of what would happen if gas was cut off to Germany explained to them by the German industry. And I suspect that over the course of this month, when payments start to fall due, a decision will be finally made by German businesses, the German energy businesses, to do what the Russians have insisted upon, which is that they open their accounts with Gazprom Bank in order to pay for the gas, with the gas being paid to Gazprom Bank, with the money being paid to Gazprom Bank in euros, but then converted by Gazprom Bank and then paid on to Gazprom in rubles. I think that the realities are, and this article in the Financial Times makes it, to my mind, absolutely clear to me that the realities are that Germany simply cannot afford, and Europe simply cannot afford, this kind of energy cut-off that would happen if they don't fall in with this scheme. I really have to say this. I don't see why they would not. It doesn't seem to me to undermine the sanctions in any fundamental way. It does look as if it does recalibrate some of the contracts, but in ways that are normal in business operations. And I would have thought that the German interest and the European interest is to keep the gas flowing, all the more so as there is now growing skepticism across the industry that the Europeans really are in any position or in any state to replace gas and oil from Russia. And whilst I'm talking about the subject of oil, I may as well also say that I read a report, I can't independently verify it, that despite the announced embargo on importation of Russian oil, the United States actually is quietly still buying Russian heavy crude because it needs it in order to convert it into diesel. Now, I'm not certain that this is the case, but that is what I have been reading. And for what it's worth, again, I believe it to be true. Well, that seems to me where we are with the economics, that's where we are with the politics, and that's where we are with the military affairs. There's also been quite a lot going on the diplomatic fronts. Sergei Lavrov, as I discussed in one of my recent programs, has just been to China. He had a very good meeting, as far as I could tell, with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi. And then he went to India. And he had meetings not just with the Indian Foreign Minister, but also apparently a very friendly meeting with the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Now, at about the same time, all kinds of Western diplomats were also flooding to India, apparently trying to persuade the Indians to distance themselves from Russia in some way. But importantly, Modi did not meet with any of these Western diplomats, though he did meet with Lavrov. And I would add that there was a meeting between the British Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, and the Indian Foreign Minister, and people who followed that meeting all describe Liz Truss as leaving the meeting feeling angry, looking angry, and apparently ice cold. So it seems that meeting in India did not go especially well. Now, there continues to be rumours that some major rupee oil deal is on the horizon. Well, we shall see. I suspect it is. I'm going to make a further guess that it's going to take some time for this deal to be processed. I understand that purchases of oil, Russian oil, have been quietly resuming on a large scale over the last few weeks. Apparently, Russian oil sales in March actually exceeded Russian oil sales in March of 2021. I can't confirm that, by the way, but I suspect that the Russians are under less pressure than seen the case a few weeks ago to finalise this ruble deal with India. And I suspect India, for its part, probably feels that this deal still needs some work. It looks like an extremely complicated deal to me. And from what I've understood anyway, it's been something that's been mooted between the Russians and the Indians for some time. The Indians seem to be open to this idea and they seem to be moving forward with it. And perhaps the events in and around Ukraine have accelerated the momentum to finalise it. But I suspect still some work needs to be done. But anyway, on the substance, the Indian position on Ukraine clearly is not changing. Well, that is India. And of course, we had Lavrov's previous very, very friendly visit to China. But all of that has been overshadowed by an extremely difficult meeting between the Europeans, the European leadership, the leadership of the EU, Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen, and the Chinese leadership led by Xi Jinping. Now, that meeting clearly did not go well because the Europeans came to that meeting apparently determined to discuss Ukraine and in effect only Ukraine. They seem to be interested, they seem to be trying to get once more the Chinese to come out and condemn the Russians, a total non-starter in my opinion, and they also seem to be trying to persuade the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians to end the war in Ukraine, which to my mind is also a total non-starter. And the Chinese, including Xi Jinping, responded, as one might have expected, by telling the Europeans that China will not take those kind of steps, and telling the Europeans that they need to start detaching themselves from the United States, that they shouldn't allow their foreign policy to be hijacked by that of the US, that they need to develop a more independent policy to that of the US. And it's very interesting to see that for once, in describing a summit meeting, the Chinese and the European media, I say the European media because the Financial Times, which I'm just about to quote from, is very widely read in Europe, that the Chinese and the European media have come up with almost identical headlines. So this is the headline that the Financial Times has given in discussing this meeting between Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership and the EU leadership of Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel. The Financial Times headline reads, "China calls on EU to act independently of US foreign policy." And then we go to Global Times. And what we read, the headline that we read there, it reads, "Xi calls on EU to form independent China policy, encourages bloc to take primary role for Ukraine resolution." And when you go further down in the article, you learn that when the Global Times article, it says that when Xi called on the EU to form an independent China policy, he meant independent from the US. There's also, by the way, rumors that Xi Jinping, or at least some Chinese officials, apparently told the Europeans that not only is the US and NATO the cause of the whole crisis in Ukraine, but that NATO is well past its sell-by date and should have been closed down following the end of the Cold War, and that it is its continued existence which is the source of the current tensions in Europe. If the Europeans were told that by the Chinese, which I can't confirm, then all I will say is that it would have probably made them extremely angry, but also extremely worried. To be told that by the Chinese must be extremely exasperating for them. But anyway, it looks as if the Western powers have failed with India, and in the case of the EU, they failed even more spectacularly with China. As various Russian commentators have been correctly pointing out, if you look at a map and you look at which countries have sanctioned Russia and which have not, it becomes immediately obvious that the sanctions which have been imposed on Russia are entirely by the Western powers, and that the rest of the world, every part of the world which is not aligned with the West, which is not part of the Western alliance system, every part of it has, every country in it has, to a greater or lesser extent, refused to participate in this sanctions war. The two exceptions are Turkey, which is a NATO state and therefore nominally an ally of the West, which has refused to impose sanctions on Russia, which has, in other words, gone against Western policy on this issue, and Singapore, which has imposed some sanctions on Russia, though it is an ASEAN state, but has done so apparently in a very unenthusiastic and somewhat ineffectual way. So there we are. There's been, in my opinion, I would just finish this somewhat long program in saying something of a change of mood. If you remember the situation a few weeks ago, it was all very fevered in the West. Let's talk about supplying Ukraine with fighter jets, MiG and Sukhoi fighter jets, of Polish forces entering Western Ukraine, NATO intervention forces entering Ukraine. All of that seems to have died down now. The Germans are providing some obsolete old Soviet infantry fighting vehicles, some of which apparently date from the 1960s. And the United States, of course, previously said that it would provide Ukraine with some ex-Soviet anti-aircraft missiles, some of which missile systems, some of which also date from the 1960s, and some of which apparently even use vacuum tubes. And there's some word now in the New York Times that the US is now thinking of supplying Ukraine with some, again, old Soviet-era tanks, former Soviet tanks, presumably left over from the Cold War, hidden away in warehouses in Eastern Europe. None of these weapon systems are going to change the balance of the battle, and in fact, the Russians appear to have little difficulty in destroying Ukrainian surface-to-air missile centers, and of course the numbers of tanks that the Russians claim that they've destroyed in Ukraine run into the hundreds, perhaps even thousands, and a few dribs and drabs of old vehicles from Europe, from NATO, old Soviet vehicles, is not going to make any significant difference. It's a token move, and one which I suspect will leave the Ukrainians feeling exasperated. Well, there we are. A situation on the military front where we look like we're approaching what may be the great climactic battle, perhaps the greatest battle Europe has seen since the end of the Second World War. An economic situation which is becoming increasingly difficult, especially in Europe, and a political hardening of the mood in Moscow, in Russia. A diplomatic situation where the US and the West is banging against closed doors in Beijing and New Delhi. This crisis still has some way to go, but it seems to me that the big sanctions games have now been played out. I think it's clear that they failed to make the knockout blow on the Russians that some expected, where, as I've said in my previous program, trapped in the West in an economic war of attrition, which is going to be increasingly hard for us. But in any event, it seems to me that it's now becoming increasingly clear that the center of this crisis, the place where it will play out, will not be through sanctions or diplomacy. It will either be on the battlefield in the Donbass or in the negotiations, the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. I hope that these negotiations do achieve some sort of outcome, because if the battle that is coming in Donbass is going to be anything like as huge as all the indications say, then inevitably thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of young men will pay for it with their lives. Thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again soon in further programs on this channel. And of course, as I pointed out at the start of this program, you can join us also on Rumble and Locals, and of course on our various other platforms. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the things that you will find there. And you can also, if you choose, join us on Locals, participate in my live streams there. And please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon.